It was just a family portrait from the 1940s, but the mother was hiding a terrifying secret. Dr. Robert Hayes had attended dozens of estate sales over the years, searching for medical antiquities to add to his collection. At 72, retired from his psychiatry practice in Burlington, Vermont, he'd developed a passion for the history of mental health treatment, particularly the darker chapters that modern medicine preferred to forget. The sale was held in an old Victorian house on Maple Street, its rooms crowded with the accumulated possessions of Dr. Harold Whitman, a physician who had died at 98. Medical books lined the walls, anatomical charts hung in frames, and boxes of patient files, names carefully redacted, sat in the basement. Robert was examining a set of psychiatric journals from the 1940s when he noticed a cardboard box tucked behind a filing cabinet. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, carefully organized in envelopes labeled by year. The handwriting on the envelopes was precise, clinical. Patient Studies, 1945-1952. He opened the first envelope. Most photographs showed institutional settings, hospital wards, treatment rooms, patients in various states of distress. These were clinical photographs, the kind psychiatrists once kept for documentation and research. Then he found one that didn't fit the pattern. It was a family portrait, professionally taken, dated 1947 on the back. A father stood behind a seated mother, his hand on her shoulder. 3 children surrounded them, 2 boys and a girl, ranging in age from about 6 to 12. They wore their Sunday best, posed in front of a fireplace in what appeared to be a comfortable middle-class home. But something was wrong. Robert's trained eye caught it immediately. The mother's posture was unnaturally rigid, her spine straight as a board. Her hands were positioned stiffly in her lap, fingers extended in an odd frozen gesture. Most striking was her face. While the rest of the family smiled naturally, her expression was blank, her eyes staring past the camera with an intensity that suggested she wasn't fully present. He'd seen that look before, decades ago in textbooks about catatonic states. Robert turned the photograph over, written in the same clinical hand as the envelope labels. Rebecca, June 1947. Rare lucid interval. Last family portrait. Robert purchased the entire box of photographs for $50. The estate sale coordinator, a young woman organizing her grandfather's belongings, seemed relieved to be rid of them. "Grandpa was a doctor at the state hospital," she explained. "He kept everything. Most of it's too medical for us to understand or want to keep." Back in his study, Robert spread the photographs across his desk. Dr. Harold Whitman had been thorough in his documentation. Each image was labeled with a first name, a date, and brief clinical notes. Most showed patients at the Vermont State Hospital, the massive psychiatric institution that had operated in Waterbury from 1891 until 2011. But Rebecca's photograph was different. It was personal, taken in a home, including family members. Why would Dr. Whitman have included it in his clinical collection? Robert searched through the other envelopes and found more photographs of Rebecca, these clearly institutional. In one from 1948, she sat in a hospital gown, her body twisted in an unnatural posture, one arm raised and frozen mid-gesture. Another from 1949 showed her lying in bed, her face a rigid mask, eyes open but unseeing. The progression was heartbreaking. In the 1947 family portrait, she appeared almost normal despite the subtle signs Robert had noticed. By 1948, she was clearly institutionalized and severely impaired. By 1950, according to the last photograph, she appeared completely catatonic. Robert found Dr. Whitman's case notes tucked into the same envelope. The handwriting was neat, methodical. Patient, Rebecca M., age 34. Admitted Vermont State Hospital, November 1947. Presenting symptoms, progressive rigidity, mutism, periods of catalepsy alternating with acute agitation. Family reports gradual onset over 3 years, worsening significantly in recent months. The diagnosis written at the bottom made Robert's breath catch. Post-encephalitic Parkinsonism with psychiatric manifestations, probable sequela of epidemic encephalitis, lethargica, circa 1920s. Robert sat back, stunned. Encephalitis lethargica, the sleeping sickness. He hadn't thought about that disease in years. It had been largely forgotten by modern medicine, a mysterious epidemic that had appeared after World War I and vanished by the 1930s, leaving thousands of survivors with devastating neurological and psychiatric symptoms. Rebecca had been one of them. and her family had hidden her condition for years before she was finally institutionalized. Robert spent the evening researching encephalitis lethargica, refreshing memories from his medical training decades earlier. The disease had been one of medicine's great mysteries, an epidemic that appeared suddenly in 1917, swept across the world, and disappeared just as mysteriously by 1928. During those 11 years, an estimated 1 million people worldwide had contracted the disease. About a third died during the acute phase. Another third recovered, though many were left with subtle neurological changes. The final third developed chronic complications years or even decades later: Parkinsonism, movement disorders, personality changes, and psychiatric symptoms that often led to institutionalization. The acute phase of the disease was dramatic. Patients fell into deep sleep states, sometimes remaining unconscious for weeks or months. Those who survived often woke changed, their brains damaged in ways medicine couldn't yet explain or treat. But it was the chronic phase, the long-term complications that appeared years later, that destroyed lives most thoroughly. Survivors who had seemed to recover would suddenly develop symptoms in their 30s or 40s: tremors, rigidity, bradykinesia. Many developed psychiatric manifestations, compulsive behaviors, mood disorders, catatonic episodes. Robert found medical journal articles from the 1940s describing these chronic cases. The language was clinical, but the suffering was evident. Patients frozen in bizarre postures for hours, unable to move or speak. Others experienced oligogeric crises, their eyes rolling upward uncontrollably, accompanied by intense anxiety and disturbing thoughts. Some developed what doctors called kinesia paradoxa. Patients who were completely frozen could suddenly move normally in response to emergency or strong emotion, only to freeze again moments later. The psychiatric symptoms were particularly misunderstood. Many encephalitis survivors were diagnosed with schizophrenia, hysteria, or moral degeneracy. They ended up in psychiatric institutions where their neurological disease went unrecognized and untreated. Rebecca's case fit the pattern perfectly. If she'd contracted encephalitis lethargica during the epidemic years, 1917 to 1928, she might have been a child or teenager. She could have recovered from the acute illness, lived normally for years, married, had children. Then, in her early 30s, the chronic complications would have begun appearing. Robert looked again at the 1947 family portrait. Rebecca would have been fighting to appear normal, to be present for this photograph, even as her brain betrayed her. Robert needed to know more about Rebecca and her family. Dr. Whitman's notes included only a first name and the dates of hospitalization, but the family portrait provided clues. The photograph had been taken professionally. He could see the photographer's studio mark embossed in the corner, though it was too faded to read clearly. He examined the image under magnification. Behind the family, visible through a window, he could make out a church steeple and what appeared to be a town square. The architectural style was distinctively Vermont: white clapboard, New England church design. Robert contacted the Vermont Historical Society, sending them a scan of the photograph. Within 2 days, a researcher named Jennifer Collins called him back. "I recognize that church steeple," she said. "That's the Congregational Church in Montpelier. And I found the photographer's mark. It's William Breslin's studio. He operated in Montpelier from 1935 to 1958. With that information, Robert drove to Montpelier and visited the town clerk's office. He explained his research into the history of encephalitis lethargica and its psychiatric manifestations. The clerk, interested in the medical history, helped him search records. They found her, Rebecca Morrison, born 1913 in Montpelier, married to James Morrison in 1935. 3 children: William, born 1935, Thomas, born 1938, and Sarah, born 1941. Admitted to Vermont State Hospital in November 1947. Died there in March 1953 at age 40. Cause of death: pneumonia with underlying neurological disease. Robert felt the weight of that information. Rebecca had spent the last 6 years of her life institutionalized, separated from her children, unable to communicate, trapped in a body and mind that no longer obeyed her will. He searched for the Morrison family in current records. James Morrison had died in 1982. Of the children, only Sarah was still living, now in her 80s, residing in a nursing home in Burlington. Robert hesitated. Should he contact her? What would it mean to this elderly woman to have a stranger appear with photographs of her mother's illness? asking questions about a painful past. But he thought of Rebecca frozen in that family portrait, her last moment of presence preserved on film. Her story deserved to be told. The truth about her illness deserved to be understood. He decided to visit Sarah Morrison. The Lakeview nursing home sat on a hill overlooking Lake Champlain, its large windows offering residents views of water and mountains. Robert called ahead, explaining to the activities director that he was researching a medical history project and would like to speak with Sarah Morrison about her mother's case if she was willing. To his surprise, Sarah agreed immediately. "I've been waiting my whole life for someone to ask about my mother," the activities director relayed. "She says she has things she wants people to know." Sarah Morrison was 83, sharp-minded despite her frail body. She sat in a wheelchair near the window of the common room, the afternoon light illuminating her white hair. When Robert approached with the 1947 family portrait in hand, her eyes filled with tears. "I was 6 years old when that was taken," she said, touching the photograph gently. "I remember that day so clearly. We'd been preparing for weeks. Mother had good days and bad days by then, and we had to wait for a good day to take the picture." Robert sat across from her, his recorder running with her permission. "Can you tell me about your mother's illness? When did it start?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I was too young to remember the beginning. But my brothers told me later that it started when I was about 3, 1944 or so. Mother began having episodes where she'd freeze up. She'd be doing something normal, cooking, hanging laundry, and suddenly she'd just stop, completely still, like a statue, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours." She described how her father, James, had taken Rebecca to multiple doctors. They all said different things. One said it was hysteria. Another said she was having nervous breakdowns because of the stress of raising 3 children. One doctor suggested she was being difficult on purpose, seeking attention. "Did anyone mention encephalitis lethargica?" Robert asked. Sarah's eyes widened. "Dr. Whitman did. He was the first doctor who understood what was really wrong with her. But by the time we found him, it was almost too late." She explained that her mother's symptoms had worsened throughout 1946 and 1947. She'd have these terrible episodes where her eyes would roll back and she'd start making these sounds, moaning, crying. She'd say terrifying things during those episodes, things that didn't make sense. My father would send us outside when they happened. Sarah's voice grew quieter as she continued her story. "My father was desperate to keep Mother at home. In those days, if a woman was sent to a mental institution, it was considered shameful. The whole family would be tainted by it. He was terrified of what people would say, what it would mean for us children." She described how James Morrison had essentially imprisoned his wife in their home. He hired a woman, Mrs. Petrova, to help during the day when he was at work. She'd been a nurse in Russia before immigrating. She understood that Mother was sick, not crazy, but there was nothing she could do except keep her comfortable and try to manage the symptoms. Robert listened, his heart heavy. This was a pattern he'd seen documented in his research. Families hiding mentally ill or neurologically impaired relatives, ashamed of their conditions, terrified of institutionalization. Mother knew what was happening to her, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. That was the worst part. In her lucid moments, she was completely aware. She'd cry and apologize to us. She'd beg Father not to send her away. She was terrified of the state hospital. Everyone was, back then. We'd all heard the stories. Those stories were true, Robert knew. In the 1940s, state psychiatric hospitals were overcrowded, understaffed, and often brutal. Patients received minimal treatment beyond sedation and restraint. Many were subjected to experimental procedures, insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy without anesthesia, even lobotomies. The photograph, Sarah continued, pointing to the family portrait, was taken during one of Mother's best days in months. Dr. Whitman had started seeing her. Father finally broke down and contacted him after Mother had a particularly bad episode where she didn't move or speak for 3 days straight. Dr. Whitman had recognized the signs of post-encephalitic disease immediately. He'd seen dozens of cases at the state hospital. He prescribed what treatments were available, mostly sedatives to calm her agitation during episodes, and he'd been honest with James about the prognosis. Dr. Whitman told Father that Mother's condition would continue to worsen, Sarah said. He said that eventually she'd need full-time institutional care, but he also told us we should document her story, that someday medicine might understand her disease better. That's why he took all those photographs. That's why we did the family portrait, to show that she was a person, a mother, before the disease took her completely. Sarah described the deterioration that followed the family portrait. By September 1947, Mother could barely move on her own. She'd be frozen for most of the day. When she did move, it was jerky, uncontrolled. She couldn't feed herself anymore. She couldn't speak, though you could see in her eyes that she understood everything we said. The psychological toll on the family had been devastating. James Morrison worked long hours at his job as a bank clerk, then came home to care for his wife. The children learned to be quiet, to stay out of the way, to not bring friends home. We became experts at keeping secrets, Sarah said. At school, if anyone asked about Mother, we'd say she had tuberculosis, that she was resting, that she couldn't have visitors. The breaking point came in November 1947. Mother had what Dr. Whitman called an oculogeric crisis. Her eyes rolled back and stayed that way for hours. She was screaming, these horrible, terrifying screams. My brothers and I were home from school. We were so frightened. William ran to get Mrs. Petrova, but even she couldn't calm Mother down. Neighbors heard the screaming. Someone called the police. They came to the door, Sarah said, her voice breaking. They saw Mother in that state and said she needed to be taken to the hospital immediately. Father tried to explain, but they insisted. They said she was a danger to herself and to us children. Rebecca Morrison was admitted to Vermont State Hospital on November 18, 1947. Father told us she'd be there for a little while, just until the doctors could help her, Sarah said, but we never brought her home again. Sarah showed Robert a small photograph she kept in her wallet, worn, faded, creased from decades of handling. It was a picture of Rebecca from before her illness, probably from the late 1930s. She was laughing, holding baby Sarah, her face radiant with joy and life. "This is who my mother really was," Sarah said. "Not the frozen woman in that family portrait, not the patient in those hospital photographs. This was my mother, loving, kind, full of life. The disease stole her from us long before she died." Robert looked at the two photographs, the vibrant young mother and the rigid woman in the 1947 portrait. The contrast was devastating. Through Dr. Whitman's notes and photographs, Robert pieced together Rebecca's years at Vermont State Hospital. The institution in 1947 housed over 2,500 patients in facilities designed for half that number. Hallways were crowded with beds. Patients with different conditions, schizophrenia, dementia, neurological disorders, were mixed together with little specialized care. Rebecca was placed in Ward C, designated for women with chronic conditions. Dr. Whitman's notes documented her steady decline. December 1947, patient remains largely catatonic. Brief periods of agitation require restraint. No meaningful communication possible. The treatments available were limited and largely ineffective. She received barbiturates to sedate her during agitated episodes. She was given hydrotherapy, immersion in warm baths meant to calm patients, though the evidence for its effectiveness was minimal. During one period, she underwent a series of electroconvulsive therapy treatments, which provided no improvement and possibly worsened her rigidity. Dr. Whitman's frustration was evident in his notes. Unlike many of his colleagues, he understood that Rebecca suffered from a neurological disease, not a psychiatric disorder. But in 1947, there was no effective treatment for post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. The medications that would later revolutionize Parkinson's treatment, L-DOPA and dopamine agonists, wouldn't be discovered for another 2 decades. Robert found visitor logs in Dr. Whitman's papers. James Morrison visited every Sunday for the first year, bringing the children once a month. Sarah had mentioned those visits. They were horrible. Mother would just sit there staring. Sometimes she'd make sounds, but no words. We'd talk to her, tell her about school, and you could see tears running down her face. She couldn't wipe them away. We'd have to do it for her. The visits became less frequent over time. Father started coming alone, Sarah had said. He said it was too hard on us children to see Mother that way, but I think it was too hard on him. He was watching the woman he loved disappear, and there was nothing anyone could do. By 1950, Rebecca was completely unresponsive. She required total care, feeding tube, turning every few hours to prevent bed sores, assistance with all bodily functions. Dr. Whitman's last note before her death read simply, "Patient exists in persistent vegetative state. Quality of life, none." Robert delved deeper into the medical literature on encephalitis lethargica, determined to understand exactly what had happened to Rebecca's brain. The disease had been first described by neurologist Konstantin von Economo in 1917, hence its alternate name, von Economo's encephalitis. The virus, though never definitively identified, attacked the brainstem, particularly areas controlling sleep-wake cycles, movement, and emotion regulation. During the acute phase, patients experienced extreme lethargy, hence sleeping sickness, fever, and sometimes bizarre psychiatric symptoms. But it was the chronic phase that had destroyed Rebecca's life. Years after the initial infection, survivors developed inflammation in the basal ganglia, deep brain structures controlling movement. The result was Parkinsonism, rigidity, tremor, bradykinesia, and postural instability. The psychiatric manifestations were now understood to result from damage to areas of the brain governing emotion, impulse control, and consciousness. The oculogeric crises Rebecca experienced were caused by abnormal activity in the brain regions controlling eye movement, accompanied by intense anxiety and sometimes disturbing obsessive thoughts. Robert found a 1973 book, Awakenings by Dr. Oliver Sacks, that documented similar cases. Dr. Sacks had treated post-encephalitic patients with L-DOPA in the late 1960s, temporarily awakening them from decades of frozen immobility. The results had been dramatic but often temporary, as patients developed severe side effects. If Rebecca had survived into the late 1960s, she might have been one of those patients. She might have briefly awakened, spoken to her children, experienced a final period of consciousness before the disease reclaimed her. But she died in 1953, 16 years too early for that possibility. Robert contacted several neurologists specializing in movement disorders, sharing Rebecca's case history and Dr. Whitman's photographs. They confirmed his assessment: classic post-encephalitic Parkinsonism with severe psychiatric manifestations. One neurologist, Dr. Patricia Chen at Johns Hopkins, was particularly interested. "These cases are important historically," she explained during a phone call. "Encephalitis lethargica taught us so much about brain structure and function. The specific patterns of damage helped us map which brain areas control movement, sleep, emotion. Your Rebecca was part of that tragic natural experiment." Robert thought about that phrase. Tragic natural experiment. That's what Rebecca had been, one of thousands whose suffering had advanced medical science, even as medicine could do nothing to help them. Robert prepared his findings for publication in the Journal of Medical History. But first, he returned to visit Sarah Morrison, bringing copies of all the materials he'd gathered: Dr. Whitman's notes, the medical literature, and his own analysis of her mother's case. Sarah read through everything carefully, tears streaming down her face. "My whole life, I've carried shame about my mother," she said finally. "People whispered about her. I heard the rumors, that she'd gone crazy, that she'd been violent, that she'd had to be locked away. I was ashamed to talk about her, ashamed to tell my own children the truth about their grandmother." Robert reached across and took her hand. "Your mother wasn't mentally ill, Sarah. She had a neurological disease. Her brain was damaged by an infection she probably contracted as a child, years before any symptoms appeared. What happened to her was not her fault, not your father's fault, not anyone's fault. It was a disease that medicine didn't yet understand and couldn't treat. The secret she was hiding in that photograph," Sarah said, looking at the 1947 family portrait, "wasn't shame or weakness or madness. It was fear. She knew what was happening to her. She knew she was losing herself, and she was terrified." Robert nodded. "That's what I want people to understand. When we look at this photograph now, we shouldn't see a shameful secret. We should see a woman fighting with extraordinary courage to be present for her family one last time. We should see a disease that destroyed thousands of lives before medicine learned to recognize and, eventually, partially treat it." Over the following months, Robert's article was published to significant academic interest. Medical historians recognized the value of Dr. Whitman's documentation. Neurology journals reprinted the case as an example of classic post-encephalitic disease. The photograph of Rebecca and her family appeared in several publications, always with the caption explaining the truth. Not a woman hiding mental illness, but a mother battling a neurological disease in an era that couldn't help her. Sarah Morrison gave interviews, speaking publicly about her mother for the first time in her life. "I want people to know who my mother was," she told one journalist. "She was loving, kind, strong. The disease took her body and her voice, but it never took who she really was inside. That woman in the photograph, frozen and rigid, she was still my mother, still fighting, still loving us even when she couldn't show it. The story resonated beyond medical circles. Families who had hidden their own relatives' mental health or neurological conditions decades earlier came forward. The photograph became symbolic of the shame and secrecy that had surrounded brain diseases in the mid-20th century, and how far medicine and society had come in understanding and acceptance. Robert kept the original photograph on his desk. Sometimes he'd study Rebecca's face, that blank, frozen expression, and try to imagine what she'd been thinking in that moment. Was she aware the disease was winning? Did she know this would be the last photograph of her with her family? Was she grateful for one final moment of presence, or devastated by what she knew was coming? He'd never know the answers, but he knew this. Rebecca Morrison's secret wasn't something to hide anymore. It was a story that needed telling, a testament to the suffering caused by diseases medicine didn't understand, the courage of families who faced impossible situations, and the importance of documenting the truth so that history wouldn't forget. That family portrait from 1947 no longer showed a shameful secret. It showed a moment of extraordinary bravery, a woman fighting to be present,